Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the second story from chapter 12 of the Road to Latin textbook. This story is called Cornelius et Filii. So we're going to come back to Cornelius, and he's going to be having a discussion with his sons. Okay? So if you haven't already, like I said, if you want to check out Nova Latin, you can see this story and all the others in a little different way. You can find an English translation, you can find grammar notes, all sorts of stuff. I know this is the second story from chapter 12, so we've already covered the grammar in a previous video, but if you ever get stuck, there's grammar notes, vocab help, a bunch of stuff that might help you just understand the Latin in a better way. So feel free to check it out. Before we dive into the story, like I always tell you, the first thing you want to make sure that you have under control is the vocab. So again, since this is the second story from chapter 12, you probably at this point should have a pretty decent understanding of the vocab, and hopefully you've practiced a little bit, maybe taken a quiz, something like that. But if you haven't, feel free to go back and make sure you brush up on it and feel really comfortable with the vocab, because it's really hard to understand what's going on when you don't know what the words mean. So that should always be your first step. Then you want to shore up the grammar. So again, we did this in the previous video talking about the new grammar for chapter 12. If you haven't done it yet, read through the grammar, make sure you feel really comfortable with it, maybe do some practice problems, something so that you feel like you're in a really good place. And that way you can read this story, and as you read, you'll see the grammar in action. It'll kind of boost up what you've already looked at. The last thing you got to do, though, is find someone you can read the story to and who can read it back to you. So hopefully that's a classmate, but it could be anyone. But by speaking the story out loud, you'll practice your pronunciation, and you'll start to catch and hear and recognize the patterns of the Latin, right? Now we're 12 chapters in. You've got a good amount of vocab. You're starting to see a lot of different endings. It's important to make sure that you don't shut off that part of your brain, and that by speaking it, you are practicing, saying these words aloud and catching the endings. The same thing will happen with the listening, right? So if you can find someone to read this story back to you in Latin and just sit there and listen to it and let it wash over you, it's really important and it'll be really helpful, because these are all good ways to learn a language, right? You don't want to just learn Latin by reading it and never actually speaking it or hearing it spoken, right? So just make sure that you're doing that too. So once you've done that, you're probably in a good place and you'll be ready to roll with this story. So let's dive in. So this story starts with Cornelius et Filii in via Appia sunt. Okay, so Cornelius and his sons, right? There's your subject, right? Cornelius and his sons. It's Filii is plural, nominative plural, so there's more than one. They are sunt in via Appia, on the Appian Way. So I put a picture of it to the right. The Via Appia is one of the more famous Roman roads in Italy, one of the older ones too, but it's still around today. You can still see it. I believe it's original. I don't think anyone's really touched it up other than clearing it out, but it's still used today. Feel free to take a look at it. It's a really interesting culture unit to dive into, Roman roads and how they built them. But that's what you're seeing on the picture to the right. Okay, so Cornelius and his sons, they're on the Appian Way. You have virum armatum vident. So here you notice none of the words are in red, right? Because virum armatum is your direct object. The subject is still Cornelius and his sons, right? So they see vident. They see the virum armatum. They see an armed man, right? Literally a soldier. Then we have vir armatus est nuntius Romanus et equum album habet. So the vir armatus, the armed man, right, the soldier you might say, is a nuntius Romanus, is a Roman messenger, right? So nuntius is an interesting word. It's actually where you get the word announcer or announcement from, because this is someone who would come and speak, right, and tell you a message. Okay, so this would be a messenger from the Roman army is kind of what they're getting at, because he is the vir armatus. So he's a Roman messenger, and habet, he has an equum album, a white horse. So he's riding this fancy horse, which makes sense, right? The Roman road system, and again, if you're interested, feel free to look it up, or on my Nova Latin textbook, I have a culture unit on this. But the road system really is a military system, right? It lets them send messages really quickly. So it would be pretty common if you're in an area with sort of active military presence, to see a messenger go by, right? And they would have different waypoints along the road where a messenger could conceivably stop, get a fresh horse, and continue on with their message. So seeing a messenger like this, I don't know if it would be an everyday occurrence, but it probably wouldn't be too out of the ordinary to see a soldier going by delivering a message, right? Then you have et nuntius et equus sunt defessi quod Romam properant. So you have et, which means both and. So you're saying both the nuntius, the messenger, and the equus and his horse, right, sunt defessi, are tired. So the rider and the horse are both tired because, quote, there's our conjunction, properant, they're hastening, right, or hustling to Romam, towards Rome. Here we have the accusative, right, showing the place to where they're going. There's no preposition needed because we're using the name of a city, right? So Romam in this context just means to Rome. So they're hastening to Rome, so they're both tired. Nuntius magnam pugnam Romanam nuntiat. Okay, so the messenger, nuntiat, he's announcing, or he's telling them, right? He's announcing a magnam pugnam Romanam, right? So this big battle. And it's a magnam pugnam Romanum, a great Roman battle. So he's coming telling them about this battle that's happened. And so then they start talking of ubi mi amice, Romani pugnat, clamat Cornelius. So where, my friend, mi amice here is vocative, right? So he's talking to the messenger. And he says, where, my friend, are the Romans fighting? Romani pugnat, right? Romani is your subject, nominative, and pugnat is your verb. Notice how it has an NT on it because you're saying they fight. So he says, where are the Romans fighting, right? Shouts Cornelius. Then the answer is Romani in Gallia pugnat Corneli, respondet Nuntius. So he says the Romans, Romani, pugnat, they are fighting in Gallia, right, in Gaul. So if you're not sure where that is, Gaul is usually equated with modern-day France, right? And I've put a map of it to the right so you can see it. This region is what the Romans would have called Gaul, and it's broken into a couple different pieces. The southern part, southern France has a really strong Roman influence. That's going to be called the province, right, later on. And then you have three major areas of the Belgians, the Celts, and the Aquitani, right? The three major sections that Caesar is actually going to lay out for us. So I'm not sure the timing of when this book is supposed to be happening. But you could imagine that it's probably talking about Julius Caesar and the Gallic Wars, right? So if you haven't looked that up, feel free to take a look. But this is the major conflict between Julius Caesar and his legions conquering the area of Gaul. So I would imagine that's probably what the messenger is talking about. So he said the Romans are fighting in Gaul, Cornelius, right? Cornelius vocative. Again, I guess the messenger must have known Cornelius, right? He calls him by name. Then you have respondet Nuntius, the messenger responds. Then you have quis est legatus, rogat Cornelius. So he asks a question. Quis means who. So who is the legatus? Who's the commander? Right, is really what he's adding. A legatus, a legate, is sort of like a lieutenant, you might say, but it's a military position in the Roman army. So he's really saying, like, who's commanding them, right? Rogat Cornelius, right? He asks. You have Romani, labienum legatum habet, respondet Nuntius. So the Romans have habent, so the Romans being the Roman soldiers, have the legate Labienus, right? So again, I'm not entirely sure if they're talking about this person or not, but Labienus is a famous commander. He's basically the second in command in a lot of ways of Julius Caesar in his campaign in Gaul. I believe he commanded his cavalry in a lot of the battles. But if that's who they're referencing here, this would be a really famous person. So again, feel free to take a look if you haven't learned about it, about the Gallic Wars, Julius Caesar, where Gaul is, and you can look up the name Labienus too, and you'll read all about him and the interesting life that he had in the Gallic Wars and after, right? But he is a famous soldier, a famous Roman commander. So he says the Romans, right? And again, you have respondet Nuntius, the messenger responds. He says the Romans have Labienus, right? The legate Labienus, the commander Labienus, okay? Then he continues. He says, Labienus gladium tenet et viros amatos vocat. Okay, so Labienus holds tenet, his gladium, his sword, his gladius, right? And he vocat, he calls for viros armatos. He's calling for armed men, right? So the idea is that he's looking for soldiers, right? Then you have tum viri armati pugnat. Okay, so after he calls, right, he calls out, vocat, to the armed men, you have then, tum, the viri armati, the armed men, pugnat, they fight, right? So then the armed men fight. So it's describing this battle and about how the legate Labienus, right, he calls out to his men, he holds up his sword, and all the Romans start fighting, right? It's kind of describing a little bit of a Roman battle for you, okay? Then it continues. And you have the conversation continuing among the family, right, between Cornelius and his sons. So Lucius nuntium et equum album laudat. So Lucius praises, right? He praises, or he kind of applauds, you might say, but praises is good. The nuntium, the messenger, right, and the equum album, and the white horse, right? So he praises him. He's very kind of, intrigued by this messenger. He idolizes him a little bit. So he looks up to him, is kind of the idea. Then you have tum parvus Publius clamat. Ego gladium magnum desidero. So then Parvus Publius, small Publius, right, young Publius, clamat, he shouts, right? And he says, I desidero, I desire, I want a gladium magnum. I want a big sword, right? So the little boy Publius is kind of energized. He's like, I want to fight, right? Says, I want a big sword, a big gladius. Then you have, he continues, says, parvi pueri semper gladios desiderat. So small boys, right, young boys, they always want, right? Desiderant, they want. Semper just means always. They want gladios, they want swords. Then you have a response. You have legati mi fili, non parvi pueri, gladios habet, respondit Cornelius. So legati means like, again, legates, lieutenants, commanders, you might say. There's a couple ways to translate it, but he's saying like lieutenants or commanders, my son, right? Not small boys. So non parvi pueri, habet gladios, have gladiuses, right? Have swords. So he's saying the soldiers, right, have swords, not little boys, is kind of the response from Cornelius. And you have respondit Cornelius, right? Cornelius responds. Then you continue, you have gladium non desideras parve publi, clamat Lucius. So Lucius shouts, right? This is the other son. He says, you don't want, non desideras. He says, you don't desire, you don't want a gladium, a sword, parve publi, right? Little Publius, right? He's talking to his younger brother. He says, tu es parvus puer. You are a small boy. Ego sum paene adultus et gladium desidero. So I am almost paene, almost an adult, right? I'm almost full grown. And I want, or I desire, a sword. So he's saying you don't want the sword, right? Because you're a little boy, but I do. I'm almost an adult, right? I'm going to go off and be a soldier. Then you have Marcus, meus filius adultus gladium habet, respondit Cornelius. Sed vos, filii mei, non estis adulti et nunc libros tabelasque non gladios desideratus, right? So he says, Marcus, right? He responds, he says, Marcus, my adult son, meus filius adultus, right? So Cornelius is talking about their older brother. He says, Marcus, my oldest, right? My fully grown son, has a gladium, has a sword, responds Cornelius. He says, but you, vos, you all, and then he addresses them, filii mei, right, my sons. You guys, right, non estis adulti, you are not adults, you're not full grown. So he says, and nunc, now, desideratus, you want or you desire. It's almost saying like you should want is kind of the implication here. But he says, you desire libros, books, and tabelasque, right? The que is an enclitic. It means and, right? So he says, you desire books and tabelas, right? The tablets, right? Non gladios, not swords. So he says, you want books and tablets, things for learning, right? Not swords. So basically what he's saying here is you're still in school. You're not adults yet. You should really focus on your education and books. Don't worry about having a sword yet because you're not old enough. Okay? So this is an interesting story. It's a nice little interaction between Cornelius and his sons, but it shows you a little bit about Roman culture too, right? The idea of Roman boys wanting to be soldiers and hearing famous stories about, men like Julius Caesar. In this case, the oldest brother, I would assume, Marcus, is already a soldier. That would be pretty typical in a Roman family, particularly one of means, right? Your oldest son would probably get educated, go off, be an officer in the army, and then launch into their career, right? So it wouldn't be that uncommon to have a bunch of boys. The oldest brother is a soldier, and the younger brothers are trying to emulate him. That's kind of what you're seeing here. So it's a good glimpse of sort of Roman family life and how the military, right, the Roman army really does play a big role in a lot of families' lives, right? They had a big army, and it was part of daily life, right? Warfare. And that's what they're hitting at here, talking about the war in Gaul. So hopefully this made some sense to you, and the Latin was pretty straightforward. If you have any questions at all, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I'll help you however I can. But if not, feel free to take a look at my textbook. You'll find a lot of the answers there, a lot of practice, things that will just kind of help you through. But hopefully now that you're into chapter 12 and the second story of it, you're feeling more confident every time we read these stories. You're feeling like you have a really good sense of them. So if you can take this story, translate it, and come up with something pretty close to the translation I'm giving you, that should make you feel really comfortable that you're on the right track. And it should make you feel pretty confident in your Latin skills. So again, keep at it, keep reading. The more you practice this, the better off you're going to feel with it. And hopefully you're feeling in a good place. Good luck.